Hey students, welcome to video 2 of your analysis essay prep. So you should have finished video 1 in which we read a speech by Margaret Thatcher about Ronald Reagan, and you should have completed the annotations in your document along with the video. So now we're going to go to our second practice. And so it should look like this. It should be a letter from Abigail Adams to her son, John Quincy Adams. And so what I'd like for you to do is you're not going to go along with the video on this one. I'd like for you to pause this video, and I'd like for you to fully annotate the reading on your own. I would like for you to annotate the reading. I would like for you to find the shifts where you would break this letter into parts to write about. I'd like for you to determine what you would prove about each part, and then I'd like for you to write your thesis. So there's 4 things I'd like for you to do before you finish watching this video. Please annotate the letter. That's the first thing. The second thing, find the shifts, draw those lines across the letter to identify the shifts. Then third, identify what it is you're going to prove in each section of the letter. And then lastly, write your thesis. So please go do those 4 things before moving on so that you can get practice doing this alone, autonomously, and then you can come back to the video and check to see how you did. All right, see you in a few. Okay, so at this point, you should have annotated the letter, noted your shifts, identified what you're going to prove about each section of the letter, and then written your thesis. So let's go ahead and see how you did. So the first thing you might have noticed, and now we're not going to have done this exactly the same, so please know that, but one of the first things you might have noticed is here where she writes, I hope, if I had thought, I should not have. And so this phrasing is it's kind of wishy-washy. It seems very apologetic, but we can tell it's a half-hearted apology, and that she still believes she's correct. So she's essentially kind of like softening up John Quincy Adams by apologizing, but we can tell that she really doesn't mean it. And that especially becomes clear later on in the letter. Then you might have noticed the you, however, to my advice, yourself, me. So here there's a juxtaposition of you and me, putting pressure on, I'm going to call him JQA to save some time, to follow her advice and succeed. So we see this division. We can tell that they probably had an argument about his going abroad before, and that she gave him the advice to go and that he was still upset with it, but she's reminding him of the advice, and we see this physical in her own writing, the division between them based upon this advice that quite literally happened in real life. Then we see understanding, opening, and daily improvement. So she's reminding her son that, and kind of comforting him in a sense, in a rather harsh way, but comforting that the situation will become easier. Then, if we continue downward, we then read that she has, this part is really good, so I underlined this entire section. Judicious traveler to a river that increases its stream the further it flows from its source, or to certain springs, which running through rich veins of minerals improve the qualities as they pass along. So here we have a metaphor, and essentially in this metaphor she explains that traveling will make him stronger and richer. So just as the stream flows further from its source, it becomes stronger, and it gathers minerals, and therefore making it richer. And this isn't necessarily a monetary richness. This is more of kind of a morality, ethics, intellect, a richness of character. And so we see her metaphor here. Then she brings back my son, which echoes here, my dear son. You might have noticed that. And so what she's doing, she's taking ownership. You are my son. You will do what I say. You will do what is expected of you, my son. And so she's showing her authority here. And again, it's underhanded, like my son, my dear son. Those could be very sweet statements, but here she's using it as a form of power to remind him that he has to listen to her. Then we see superior advantages, tender parents, and here she's reminding him of the high expectations that they have for him. He's lived a very privileged life with very tender and caring parents who took care of him and instructed him, and therefore he needs to act accordingly. And so they have high expectations for him. And then she states, nature has not been deficient, which is quite a sentence. And essentially it's saying that if he he fails, the failure is his fault alone. There's nothing in his past that he can blame. It will only be himself. Then we see a genius, calm, the repose, and then we see Cicero, and roused and kindled and inflamed. So what's the purpose of all of these elements? So it alludes to the genius of Cicero, and it emphasizes that difficulty leads to achievement. So it's the idea that she's saying geniuses don't become geniuses when things are calm and reposed. They become geniuses when they've been roused, kindled, and inflamed. And then she alludes to Cicero. So here, through metaphor and through allusion, she's alluding, she creates this sense that that by meeting these high expectations, by becoming a genius, he will become strong and great, and of great character. All right, let's continue moving forward. So here we see that wisdom and penetration are the fruits of experience. So this continues what she's been arguing before. She creates an analogy that experience is the plant upon which wisdom grows. And so again, this goes along with her Cicero allusion, the idea that to become great, you need to experience difficulties. And she rephrases that through this analogy rather. Then we see great and hero and statesman. And so we see the repetition of great to indicate what he could become if he follows her advice. Again, it all goes back to this advice that she's trying to get him to follow. And therefore, he can become a great hero and statesman if he just does what she says. Then she brings in the Almighty. Here we go. So what she does is now she's calling to God. If he doesn't owe her this, if he's not going to listen to her, then he at least owes God and should listen to God. And her advice is supported by the Almighty. That's quite an argument to make that God supports the advice that she gave to her son. And so we see this continued. We see, yet it is your lot, which is another biblical allusion. Then we see glorious defense, invade liberties, generous, powerful ally, blessing of heaven. So what is the purpose of all of these? Well, it's saying that he owes both the heroes of the past and their allies and God. Therefore, he better not let down all of these people. So she harks to history and the heroes. She harks to the people who need them now in the present. And again, she goes back to the Almighty, the blessing of heaven. And so first she starts out by reminding him that he owes her this, but then she goes even further and really kind of dishes more and more pressure onto John Quincy Adams as to what he needs to achieve. Let's continue forward. So next we see every power, faculty, apparent, trust, honor. Some of these things might be sounding familiar, things that your own parents have said to you. But what's happening here, she then returns to herself and his father and says, and most importantly, he can't disappoint his father or mother. She's kind of, even though you'll notice she says a parent, she doesn't necessarily say his father. So you can read this as her talking about his father who he's with right now abroad, but she could also be talking about herself, which I think is really interesting. And so essentially she emphasizes that his parents have used every power and faculty, that he needs to use every power and faculty of his mind because his parents have done so much for him, and that it's up to him to be, that he's been trusted to uphold this honor of his family. And so again, she puts on even more pressure onto him to succeed and to follow her advice. And so here we come to the ending, and there's a lot to look at here. Sorry if this looks a little crazy, but we have again truth, which trust, truth, honor, pleasing, hope, dictates, justice, fortitude, virtue, honor your country, happy, particularly your ever affectionate mother. Oh, she's so manipulative here. And so she's using a great deal of either or reasoning. Listen to your mother or you will be a failure. So she sets up all of these virtues, the idea of hope and truth and justice and fortitude and honor. And essentially she says that she's implying that if he doesn't listen to her, he will forsake all of these things. And then the ending is almost humorous. You might identify with poor John Quincy Adams and therefore find this very annoying, but there is a lot of humor here when she ends it, happy, particularly your ever affectionate mother. This goes back to my son, my dear son. It's the idea that she's using this affectionate phrasing, but we can tell that she means business, that it's ultimately a threat. And so the humor of this letter goes into the fact that she's threatening her son, but this threat is like facaded behind kind of this motherly love of I just want what's best for you. All right, so now let's go and see where the shifts occur. Where did you mark your shifts? So, so the first shift comes right here after the first two paragraphs that we see right here. So we draw it right here. And the purpose of this opening section is it's referencing back to a previous argument and using false comfort to soften her son's possible anger. All right, where does the next one occur? So the next one occurs in this section right here, in which it uses the metaphor and allusions to encourage her son to deal with his difficulties and also to be a genius. So we are going to look at the metaphor and the allusion in which she's using to encourage her son towards greatness. Our next shift occurs here. So the previous one ends here with the greatness and the allusions and the metaphor. And our third section is here. And this is where she's calling to God. So she stresses that he cannot let down authority, allies, heroes, and God. So here she's appealing to authority and essentially warning him that if he doesn't become a genius, he could let down these very important people. And then the very last section is here, the last two paragraphs, where she essentially explains, most importantly, he can't let down his parents. Therefore, he either needs to listen to her or be a complete failure. Okay, so let's look at these sections together. So we see how these build here. It references the previous argument and tries to establish some kind of like softening of the anger, but then she returns right back to the argument once she kind of takes down his defenses. And she uses a metaphor and allusion to encourage her son to be a genius because his life has given him that ability and he can't squander it. And then that goes into the threat that if he doesn't follow this advice, if he does squander his genius, if he doesn't become the River and Cicero, then he will be letting down some very important people, allies, heroes, and God. And then she ends it going back to kind of like her motherly authority, saying most importantly, he can't let her and his father down, and therefore he needs to listen to her advice or he will be a failure. And so that's how this builds and leads us to this thesis. So let's see how this thesis compares to the thesis that you wrote. And note how it goes in this order. Determined that her son must follow her advice, Abigail Adams at first appeases him with an empty apology, but then moves to demands of his genius that will honor his allies, heroes, and God, and most importantly, his parents. So this thesis is a little more simple than the one we saw in the previous video, but it's because that the letter is more simple ultimately than the speech. It's an easier item to analyze and to write on, and therefore our thesis is a little more simple. But this is ultimately what you should be arguing in your essay, and we have each of the paragraphs here. Now, if you are not writing 4 paragraphs yet, you'll need to condense this into 3. So for instance, you might join these two together, or you might join these two together. It's up to you. All right. So you have finished your practice for tonight. Tomorrow you will go in and watch video 3, and you'll be using the analysis essay that you've already written, your analysis essay 1, and using video 3 to figure out where you can improve. Then from there, on Wednesday or Thursday, you will write your next analysis essay. All right, I will see you in video land tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching. Bye. Oh, and P.S. before you go, tomorrow what you'll need to turn in to me are both of your documents that I provided to you, both the speech and the essay, and they should be fully annotated with your shifts and your theses written. All right? Okay, now, bye for real. See you tomorrow.